Machine quilters often talk about the term stitching in the ditch, or SID. What does that even mean? And when or how would a quilter even use it? Let's talk about it. I'm Susan Smith and you're in my studio, Stitched by Susan. I help machine quilters by pulling back the curtain on my own quilting studio and letting you see behind the scenes of some of my projects, the decisions, the challenges, the discoveries, the joys, all those things, and talk very honestly about them. So today's topic is stitching in the ditch on a quilt top. Let's have a closer look. First off, to give you the big picture, here's a look at the quilt that I'm working on. It's a very scrappy quilt with 16 patches within these larger blocks. So now you have kind of a big picture of what we're working on, and we'll do an up close and personal look at the ditches and the stitches. Here is one of our 16 patch blocks. And when this quilt was pieced, Laura, who pieced it, pressed her seam allowances to the side. So for example, in this flying goose rectangle here, this seam right here is pressed toward the cream colored side. So I've got a ridge formed here. This side is lower, this side is higher. All the seam allowance pieces are coming this way. So the lower side we call the ditch. And stitching right along that ditch will emphasize this seam line, will really make it pop. It's just a really good focal point. So applied to this quilt now, in these 16 patch pieced squares, I'm going to do a crosshatch. You can see this one is already done. And I would like a row of stitching outlining the entire 16 patch. Here's the trick though. On this side and this side, my seam allowances are pressed away from the 16 patch, meaning I've got a ditch on the patchy side. So the decision I have to make then is, am I going to stitch in the proper ditch, which means I would stitch along the triangle side, close to the seam, as close as I can without going over, but on the triangle side? Or am I going to stitch on the hill side, just a couple of threads in and stitching through all that seam allowance thickness there? And so the truth is, there's no right or wrong way. It is up to the quilter which way they choose. But knowing that elsewhere in the quilt, sometimes that ditch ended up with a very light creamy color on the ditch side, and knowing that I'm stitching with a darker caramel colored thread, as you can see here, I opted to never do my stitching on that cream ditch. It just is so obvious then when you see it. So wherever I'm stitching around this 16 patch now, I opted to stitch always on the 16 patch. So I've got ditch, ditch, and let's call them hill, hill, but it is again just inside that 16 patch. So I still am left with a really nice outline, and in fact on the underside of my quilt that's a very pleasing look too. I have a nice perfect square there. In other applications with other thread choices, you might have chosen to go ditch, ditch on this side and then to stitch on this other side. On the other two, that's entirely up to you. One more thing about stitching in the ditch. Sometimes piecers press their seam allowances open instead of to one side or the other. And as you can imagine then, there's not so much of this ditch going on. The answer there is you can stitch on either side of it, but you must not stitch right on the stitching line. You stitch a tiny bit to one side or the other. And much like choosing weather ditch or weather hill, you can decide which side you prefer the stitching to be on, but you don't want to stitch just along the sewing threads, or that's all that's catching in your seam and that will be a wear point. So you want to stitch onto the fabric by a tiny bit, less than a 1/16 of an inch, and it will still have the appearance of stitching in the ditch. Stitching in the ditch is a great technique to use when you're doing any kind of custom quilting and you want to outline or emphasize any of the shapes or blocks on the quilt. Or if you have a quilt that's got a lot of applique, again, stitching just outside but up against in that ditch against the applique will really lift the applique and emphasize it. So I hope you'll give this a try on one of your upcoming custom quilted projects.